It's the 1960 Democratic presidential nominations, and Hubert Humphreys is in his car alongside his entourage, driving between events. The group is accompanied by a cameraman who is filming the group and Humphreys in particular on his journey throughout the election. This sequence from Robert Drew's 1960 film Primary has often been touted for its influential nature, often becoming a fallback shot for hundreds of later documentarians, and not just because it features a US politician taking a nap, but rather because it's able to provide movement in an otherwise static scene. Primary is an early example of a film coming from the film movement which sprung from the late 1950s and early 1960s, known in the US as direct cinema, or perhaps known more famously from its parallel but not completely the same movement in France, Cinéma Vérité. Films from this movement made use of the newer, more portable film camera technology in order to follow their subjects around throughout their daily happenings, capturing footage of their protagonists in sequences which required little to no staging at all to set up. In accompanying these protagonists, sometimes for weeks at a time, those being filmed would begin to associate the camera which was following them around with the quotidian rather than the novelty, which allowed Cinéma Vérité filmmakers to capture what they believed to be truth in life and film. As described by Betsy McLean in her book A New History of Documentary Filmmaking, the style's filmmaking techniques, such as the frequent use of long, unedited tracking shots, pulls towards individuals, towards continuous recording of their words and actions, towards narrative, so much so that McLean goes on later in this essay to distance Cinéma Vérité from other styles of documentary cinema, suggesting it to be closer to narrative fiction films than to the descriptive, expository, argumentative, experimental, or poetic and experimental forms of documentary. It is no surprise then that the techniques pioneered by Cinéma Vérité filmmakers have bled quite extensively into the world of fiction filmmaking. When used in fiction films, Cinéma Vérité style filmmaking techniques tend to add an extra element of emotion into the films. So in films like Michael Haneke's Cachet, the heavy use of long takes and self-reflective references to the act of filmmaking and spectating add an element of voyeurism, pointing audiences back towards themselves and prompting them to question their own involvement in the act of spectatorship. Haneke's film is, in a way, about an amateur Cinéma Vérité filmmaker harassing a family with films that he's made of them. However, whilst it was perhaps an unexpected side effect, Cinéma Vérité documentaries typically did not aim to generate a sense of voyeurism. Rather, Cinéma Vérité filmmakers such as Jean Rouch or Robert Drew wish to, as Jean Hall writes, offer viewers greater access to the truth, which is perhaps why the most pervasive use of Cinéma Vérité style techniques in fiction filmmaking can be found within the horror genre. It is not uncommon for horror films to try and bring the horror away from the screen and closer to the world of the audience. Some films in this genre will start with a title card suggesting them to be based on a true story, even when the story is completely fictional. Other films, like The Blair Witch Project or Cannibal Holocaust, will even go as far as to feign the real-life disappearances of the leading actors as a result of the events of the film, the latter of which ended up in quite a serious lawsuit as a result. Cinéma Vérité's legacy in these films can also be quite clearly seen. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for example, makes use of the old grainy visuals which John Hall suggests in Cinéma Vérité films had come to signify truth, perhaps partially as a result of the more portable filming equipment of the 50s and 60s being of a slightly lower quality than their less portable counterparts. However, as Cecilia Sayad notes in her essay Found Footage Horror and the Frame's Undoing, if the use of grainy visuals contributed to an aesthetic of realism to the horror movie, the found footage specimen takes this to the extreme by literally framing the film as factual. The found footage film is almost the epitome of Cinéma Vérité's legacy in fiction filmmaking. By placing the protagonist into the role of the cinematographer, the film and its narrative is presented as if a documentary of real-life events. The handheld Cinéma Vérité filming style contributes to some of the psychological horror of these films, utilising the documentary style's ability to remind viewers of the specific, hence limited, perspective of the filmmaker, and let them know that there is more to the world than they are often able to see. Oren Peli's Paranormal Activity takes Cinéma Vérité filming techniques a step further, going as far as to name his own protagonists after the names of the actors, and doing away with any formal script, instead having the actors improvise much of their lines in order to bring their actions, acting, and performances as close to realism and film truth as possible. Of course, the legacy of Cinéma Vérité in fiction films is by no means relegated only to the horror genre. It just so happens to be incredibly pervasive throughout this genre as a result of the particular emotional responses that the documentary style is able to evince, and of course, the parallels that these emotional responses have with those of the horror film.